My name is Kelly Weber, and I'm a poet living in northeast Nebraska in a rural, kind of near the Norfolk area. And I am a poet, and I've got a different day job. I work as a paralegal full-time and do my art and my writing in between other occupations during the day.
My name is Julie Paschold. My pen name is Tansy Julie the Soaring Eagle. I am from Norfolk, but I grew up in Lincoln, lived in Beamer for a short period of time. I would love to be a poet full-time, but I have 2 agronomy degrees, so I'm a seed sales support specialist with LG Seeds in Battle Creek.
I obtained my bachelor's and master's of English education at Wayne State College, which is where I was also introduced to poetry by many wonderful poets there, and then obtained my MFA in poetry from Colorado State University, and spent about 7 years or so living in Colorado.
I have both my bachelor's and master's degree in agronomy. My master's degree is in a soil and water emphasis from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, where I also worked for the USDA Agriculture Research Station.
I think so much of my poetry focuses on place, and I know that something I thought about, especially in my first 2 books of poetry, is how queerness shows up in Nebraska. And I think we have many, I think, wonderful queer poets living in Nebraska, and I also feel like I maybe wasn't exposed to a lot of that sort of when coming up through the initial poetry collections I was reading, which were beautiful, and I was interested in seeing more of that queerness reflected. And I think when I started really actively writing poetry, I found the landscapes of Nebraska just really showing up again and again in my work, and thinking about the wind and the landscapes here and how much that interacts with or interfaces with how I think about intimacy, how I think about queerness, how that shows up here, and especially in a state that sometimes gets characterized as like, oh, it's all red state, there's no queer people here, and that's certainly not true. There's lots of queer people here and in rural spaces, and I think those are areas I'm really interested in writing into as a poet.
The Great Plains has influenced my poetry, mostly in myself as a scientist and my degrees in agronomy, in the nature that abounds in the Midwest. We think of ourselves mostly as soybeans and corn, the fields that surround us, but there's so much more that goes on. There's the soil and the plants, there's the biota in the soil. There's so much with Mother Nature that goes around. We interact as humans with nature. There's exploring all of that, and that's comes out in my poetry. I think even when I'm writing about people, about my experiences that aren't necessarily nature, somehow that is explored. Even nature is somewhere in there, interlocking in my poetry, just as a being here in the Great Plains.
My family has been such a wonderful source of support. Both of my parents are artists, and I feel really very, very fortunate to have grown up in a household that really valued the arts and valued reading, and I feel like so much of what I write would only be possible because of that, and so I'm super grateful for that. I'm also so grateful for the mentors I've had, both at Wayne State College and at Colorado State University, for introducing me to work, exposing me to poetry. I had no interest in poetry really prior to college. I wanted to be a fiction writer, even though I had no interest in plot or dialogue or character, and sort of found my way into communities of poets. And I think the way that poetry has shown up for me is always interfaced through community and through groups that have offered space for that, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm very grateful to authors like Julie that I've been able to read with and to meet through the process of bringing books into the world and reading. It's such a community process, and I'm so grateful to the friends that I value so much who are also writers, who are thinking so carefully about how we move through the world. Those have been, I think, the biggest influences on my work as I've moved forward as an artist.
My influences, I need to start with my mother. She is now retired, but she was an English teacher, and from the very beginning introduced me to words. And both of my parents encouraged me to just be who I was, explore what I wanted to be. And my mom never pushed English on me, but allowed me to explore that. And her own writing, I never mimicked it, but we took similar journeys through that. Through the Nebraska Scholars Institute, I met Bill Clefcorn, and he became a lifelong mentor to me until he passed away. And I would send poems to him back before we had email, and he would scrawl in the columns beside there, he would write comments about, have you tried this? And he allowed me a closer intimacy with my poetry and made me think about more than I would have ever thought without him. He introduced me to Marge and Twyla and to a new expanse of poets, contemporary poets, than I would not have without him. There's also one of my English teachers, my senior high school, who allowed me to be who I was and to think outside the box. We were doing an essay test. We were supposed to write essays, and I handed in poetry instead. And she said, I cannot give you an A because it's not an essay, but this is B+. She knew that I processed through poetry and not essays. And in allowing me to just be who I was, that opened up a new doorway to me as well.
Yeah, I was joking recently with somebody who is sometimes poets when asked, what are your poems about? We tend to kind of shrink up in our little snail shells. And a question sometimes that I think about as a writer is, what are we obsessed with at any given moment as artists? And so I think that my obsessions, my curiosities, my questions drive so much of my poetry. I feel like I'm always conducting some kind of inquiry into queer intimacy in my life, how I'm moving through the world, what are the questions, some questions I can't even formulate. I think so much of what makes poetry is inarticulable. Sometimes we don't even know the question or the area of concern around which a poem or a book or poetry is cohering. And I think embracing that strangeness is a really necessary part of being a poet, of doing the act of poetry. And so I think my poems and my books are things that cohere around areas of interest, around questions that I have, around kind of like purling around those like grits and grains that I can't seem to really shake from my thinking.
I think it's funny that some people will be talking about a subject and they'll say, I have a poem about that. What are my poems about? What are they not about? I have also joked that I compulsively write. It was a couple years ago that my mom had asked me, how many poems have you written? I'm not young anymore, so it was not a small number. At that time, it was about 750. And I did not have a book out. I've had a couple poems in literary journals here and there. She said, isn't it time for a book? I write to process things. I write when I'm inspired. I walk a lot, and something will just come to my mind. It'll come as a poem. I think in poetry sometimes. And I'm inspired by when I walk by and I will see something happening and I will try to process as that person and write as that person and say, what are they thinking? One time I sat at my back doorstep and I looked down and I was at my doorstep and there was a jumping spider sitting at the same spot at his doorway too, to his home. And we were just sitting there together and I thought, this is a poem. Some people would jump at the jumping spider. Me, I greeted him and say, hello, you are a poem, how are you? And it just, the smallest things can sprout poetry. And I think that's just beautiful.
I definitely find that my preference is to write in the morning. I find that's when I'm usually at my freshest. I get up early and I write before my work shift for the day, for whatever the plans are for the day. So I frequently get up before sunrise in order to do that. Later in the day, I just find that I don't have access to the same kinds of, I think, creative spaces in terms of just how my mind works. I try to do that every day as much as I can. Without needing to rigidly adhere to that. You know, certainly there's mornings when there's not going to be the time to do that, but that's what I try to do, and at least do an hour or two at it if I can. And then when I'm finishing up a manuscript or I'm coming to a point of cohesion or coherence on a project, then it might be several hours at a time if I can find a day or two here and there in order to do that.
If I don't have an idea in my head, I usually need to have long stretches of time without a due date at the end or something like, I have a meeting at 5, it's 4. I can't write then in that hour. But sometimes, like when we're at a reading and Kelly's reading a poem, it will inspire me right then at that moment, and I will have the poem in my head and I have to scrawl on a piece of paper right there and it will just come to me. Or one time I was at my parents' house taking a walk in their neighborhood, and I came into their house and I said, I have a poem in my head, where's your paper? And I sat down at the kitchen table and just started writing it out, and Mom said, there she goes. And so sometimes I would love to be that person who writes in the morning when the sunrise comes up with a coffee, but I don't wake up so well. So I need time to just wake for a while and interact with the world, and then my brain says, okay, now you're awake, here's the world, now here's your poem.
You know, I think so often when writing a poem, for a long time, it's just me and the poem, and it's a very interesting and strange process. It's almost like poetry, or the writing mind has its own kind of consciousness, and I'm trying to listen to that as much as possible, more so than even talking on the page. I'm just trying to listen to the poem and to what it needs. And then with time, as the poem coheres, and especially reading it out loud to audiences, that's when I often, I think, feel a sense of how is this interacting with an audience? Who is this addressed to? In some cases, some of my poems are addressed to friends and to people that I know with whom I'm always in sort of poetic conversation. And I've had a number of friends who've joked like, oh, you showed up in a poem. And I think that's kind of the same for me as well, where we show up in each other's poems. We're always sort of talking with one another. I feel like poems often grow out of conversations that I'm having with friends. And it's always kind of a dialogue. At its core, I think it's a dialogue between me and the poem, or between the poem and the page in a lot of ways.
Sometimes my poems are written to specific people. I have a recent poem that I just wrote. It's a love poem to my daughter. It's specifically for her, just for her. Sometimes I will write a poem to process as a private poem for me, just to process something that I'm trying to wrap my head around. I don't know what's happening here. I need to write through this, and I'll even write several poems on that, but it's still to be shared. My son joked in a serious way that my poems were like poetry for dummies in a good way. And I took that as a compliment, because he said, it means when I leave your poem, I know what I left with. I carried something away from your poem. It's not, I didn't leave empty-handed. I didn't leave confused. I know what you were saying. And I want someone to leave my poetry carrying something back with them, holding something. And that's my goal.
I think for me, one of the things that's so gratifying about writing a book is that it's often a product or an archive of a particular kind of inquiry. Not only a particular inquiry into a subject matter or a question, but I think every book is a new approach to what I think poetry can be for me. And I think every book sort of, for me, redefines what poetry can look like for me. And so writing this newest book that's come out, so much of this book was about finding language for particular types of queer platonic intimacies, which was something that I just hadn't seen named very much in poetry, or hadn't seen articulated in, at least in the collections that I had read. And so writing this book gave me access to so much of that. It showed me so much who I was. It helped me come out to myself first as trans non-binary. It unlocked so much for me. And then I think bringing it into the world and sharing it with readers has been so gratifying, you know, to be able to, I think, connect with audiences who may resonate with that and who may or may not have encountered poems that offer that kind of resonance or offer that kind of familiarity of experience. And so I think the most gratifying part of a book, once it's done and it's in kind of its static form, I'm not writing into it anymore, is getting to discover all sorts of new connections with readers, with audience members. In many ways, that becomes the ongoing poem of the book.
I actually had the title to my book ever since I was an undergraduate in college, but I never knew what I wanted to do with it. Horizons, I took my first soil science class. That's a great idea for a book, and then I set it aside and forgot all about it. It wasn't until a few years ago when my mom had suggested, hey, that book, where is it? And so I didn't really set out to write a book. It was afterwards that I was collecting pieces. And Horizons is really a collection of 3 mini books in one, because each horizon has a different subject. So it was kind of like researching life. And I joke in the nature one, in my last section, I actually bought a college botany book to read for fun. So I just like science. It was fun to me to research that, to kind of peel back the layers of what was my college education about again. What did I experience there? What's nature like in the DNA of nature? Not just seeing the bird that's blue, but what is it like under the cells? And that's kind of what it was like, digging into the soil all over again. And how do I explain that to somebody who's never seen a soil as a horizon before? How do I explain that to somebody in layman's terms and have them go back and enjoy it and not think, okay, you're preaching to me, I can't read anymore. So I wanted you to enjoy it, but still learn something when you came across.
My best advice would be to be patient, because it's going to take a while, and to also know that there's no rush. You know, take your time to do it. I think sometimes as artists, we feel like I just want this to be in people's hands, and I want that validation. When actually, you know, your work is going to evolve so much, and in some ways quite quickly. Give yourself time to just play, to not feel rushed to put something out into the world, to not feel rushed to get it out there. I think sometimes there can be this urgency to put our poems immediately into a capitalistic space, and I feel like there should be more room for art that doesn't have to do that. So take your time and really think about why you want to be published. What is it that you hope to gain out of that? And do research and homework on publications. What are publications you enjoy that feel aligned with your values? And then from there you can start the process maybe of submitting, but there's no rush. Be patient, take your time, and above all, prioritize the work and trust the work, because I also feel like that's the most gratifying part of this process. You know, sometimes publication in many ways is so different from the act of writing and the act of creating, and they're two very different processes. And sometimes we may really like the art part and then may find that aspects of the publishing part feel really challenging to engage with, and that's okay. And it's okay for you to take the time to learn how you feel about that. And so just be patient and take your time and focus on the writing, making the writing the best that it can be.
When it comes to writing, I always recommend get uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is don't stick with the same thing. Do something, try on a coat that you think doesn't fit. Try a form that you've never tried before. Try a prompt that feels like you don't know anything about it. Do something that you've never done before. If you only write free form, try a form poem. Oh, I don't do forms. Try one. Try a long poem if you only write short ones. Try something that you've never tried before, because you never know, that could be your new thing that you could amaze yourself. That's what I recommend in writing, is just always keep trying new things. And as far as publishing, you don't have to publish young in order to be successful. Look at me, I'm not young, and I have my first book out. So just keep trying and keep at it. And just like Kelly said, be patient with it. It doesn't always come right away, and it can be a very frustrating thing. And just because you get a book out doesn't mean you're done. It means the journey, a new journey has just started. And even getting one poem out there and published is a huge, huge accomplishment, and be proud of just that one thing. Just keep going and find someone to mentor you, find someone to look up to.
I think that what I hope every new book and project can do is something totally different from the previous book. I think we revisit a lot of our interests as writers. At least I know I do. There's a lot of things that I probably revisit between book one and book two. And at the same time, I think I'm always interested in what's something new that I can try. What's a new way to approach my sense of poetics? A new form, listening to the work even more. I think every book that I write, and really every poem that I write, is an attempt to be more honest than preceding poems and books. As I find new ways to write, and as I keep evolving throughout my life, I keep finding new ways and forms to be honest. And so that's what I hope my future work continues to do and continues to achieve. And you know, working on new work right now, and I think just allowing that space for it to really listen to the work, and that sometimes means setting aside, what do I want the work to do? What do I think the work should look like? What looks marketable for a book? And instead just trusting the strangeness of the book and its own process and its own particular inarticulable consciousness.
My daughter and I just finished recording an audiobook. We recorded Horizons. I have a poem in there called I Can See Clearly Now. It is about my blind great-grandmother, and I was thinking, if I have that, I need to have that accessible to them, to the blind population, and to anyone who doesn't read, who can't read, who cycles to work and needs something to listen to on their way, who drives a long distance and just needs something to read. So we have an audiobook coming out. Thank goodness she knows how to do that, and God bless her for all those hours of listening to my voice. So that's the project we just completed. My mom and I, we have a prompt a week. We take the same prompt and we write a poem on it, and we email it to each other, and then we comment. And it is amazing how different our poetry is using the same prompt. And that's something we have been doing for a number of months, a couple years now that we've been doing, and something we will continue to do as long as we can. And it is National Poetry Month. I am writing a poem a day. Robert Brewer on Writer's Digest sends out a prompt. Every day I've been writing a poem, and I squeeze in a little time to do that. So yesterday's prompt was living. I turned it on its head, talked about the fallen leaves, picking up the dead of the living. So always working on new things, manuscripts, have a couple in the works.
One of the most exciting things about poetry is this space that it can offer us that's separate from fiction and nonfiction, yet can draw from those things. It's not a genre I thought I was going to write in, and then have ended up sort of writing in it long term, which was certainly never anything that I expected. And I know a lot of folks sometimes express that they don't get poetry, or poetry may not be for them. We were just talking about that recently at an event. And I think poetry can sometimes sneak up on us and surprise us with the types of attentions that it offers us, and an attention of moving through the world. And I think poetry has enabled me to have a certain attention to the world, and it also is through poetry through which I think I've really found and become myself and attuned to that and what I value and what I hope to practice in the world. And so I think for anybody who is not sure, or may feel like, oh, I haven't picked up a poem, or I haven't really written a poem in a long time, you may be surprised by it. I certainly was, and I tried to leave poetry, and it just has kind of stuck with me over the years. And I think that's a really special thing that it can offer us, and I would encourage anybody who has even some interest, find a poem or a poet whose work really speaks to you. Again, it doesn't have to be just dead white guys. There's so many wonderful authors in the world, like Chen Chen and Dinez Smith and Jericho Brown, who offer us so many wonderful ways of thinking about poetry, who offer such beautiful and vivid work. And find the poems that speak to you and that access and allow you to unlock the parts of yourself that you may not have even known were there.
I'd like to leave with, for those of you who don't do poetry, you haven't met the right poem. And for those of you who think you can't write poetry, you haven't met the right poet. My son, God bless his soul, is an electrician's apprentice. Thought he couldn't do poetry, and we were sitting on the picnic table, and he was putting on his steel toe work boots, and we had a conversation, and it turned into a poem. He doesn't do poetry, but he does. So if he can do poetry, anyone can do poetry. And I just want to encourage anybody, find your poem, find your poet. And if you don't read, there are tons of spoken poets out there as well. So if you don't write poetry, you speak it.
Welcome to the John H. Ames reading series here at the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors at Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Amber Stevenson, curator of our collection here. For those not familiar with the Heritage Room, our mission is to preserve and celebrate works by and about Nebraska authors. It's supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association and the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. We're grateful for their help, which makes events like this possible. The Ames Reading Series gives Nebraska authors the opportunity to share their works with our community, and this is the 229th program since its beginning in 1985. Today, we are delighted to host two writers who will share their poetry with you, Julie Paschold and Kelly Weber. Julie S. Paschold, also known as Tansy Julie the Soaring Eagle, is a queer disabled poet and artist from Nebraska. They have their BS and MS in agronomy from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Their first book, Horizons, published by Atmosphere Press, is a collection of poetry honoring soil, one of our non-renewable resources. Julie has been published in AKA's Advocate, Fine Lines, Plain Songs, The Awakenings Review, the Nebraska Writers Guild, The Raven's Perch, Iconoclast, The Radical Teacher, and several publications on Medium.com. Two of their chapbooks won honorable mentions in contests by Writer's Digest in 2021 and 2022. Julie sells their sketches at Ravenwood in Norfolk, Nebraska. Please welcome Julie.
Thank you, and welcome. I'm going to be reading from Horizons, which most of you think of as the junction between earth and sky, but the soil also has horizons. My book is divided into horizons. We will be starting with the parent material, which is about family. I will open up with Arbor Day to my twin sister. Do you remember when we thought you were allergic to the crab apple trees at the top of the hill at our grade school? I was so mad at those trees for being so beautiful. Those delicate petals falling so dramatically, yet so serenely to the grass below. The flowers hugging their branches tightly in hues of magenta, burgundy, and lilac, between creased, pointed oval leaves and smelling so sweetly. I did not want the desire to walk up that hill and take each future fruit into my hands, to talk to it gently, to learn of the earth and the grass and its creatures below. But there I was, a plant lover and a critter lover even then, betraying my allergy-ridden other half, whispering, tell me your secrets, O rooted one, and I will listen with rapt attention and eager eye. Though my heart may scatter and scar, I will come back to both of you, giver of life and keeper of soul. I am here to listen again, so tell me and root me, dear tree, dear sister, tell me. Now this book covers several decades. And although my son is 6'6" and 20 years old, he was once a toddler at 3.5. And if you know toddlers, they take their time when you walk with them. This is how to live life, according to my 3.5-year-old. When you go on a walk to the bank, 5 blocks, take an hour to get back home. Observe each stick, each crack in the sidewalk, each different plant. Delight in the discovery of 2 snakes and their stripes and their tongues and the fact that you can see into their home through the space between the door and the steps. Marvel at the yellow beetle stalking a blade of grass. See beauty in the ants transporting their treasures after you've moved the stepping stone away. Be timidly jubilant at the opportunity to tour an ambulance because by chance you run into your neighbor cleaning the firehouse. Ask questions. Realize that each man and each woman have the potential to act as daddy and as mommy to someone and call them that. Mourn the sunset. Fight the night because it means a delay in discovery. Relish cuddles with loved ones. Enjoy raspberries and being tickled. Chase cats and dogs just to touch their fur. See each person's body as a part of God and therefore lovely. Kiss your mommy at least 8 times each night. Smile at daddy when he comes home. Adore rides in pickups and payloaders. When reading a picture book, make up your own stories. Keep your rituals. It is in the little things that God appears. Now, if anybody wonders what tansy is, it's a noun that comes from the Greek word athanatos, or a for anti, plus thanatos for death, meaning immortal. It's also a descriptor for other weeds, such as tansy mustard, or a bitter herb. This is tansy season. Sometimes I'll be standing in a field and it looks like I'm doing nothing. I'll tell you, shh, I'm listening with my eyes. Today, I see a small plant with lacy leaves and delicate yellow flowers in April. It seems too early to see blooms, but for these tough winter annuals, this tansy mustard, it's just another day in the sun. And looking small and delicate is a ruse for how resilient Mother Nature has created her children that proliferate this early. A child of the aster family, cousin of the daisy, tansy's root word is a relative of death, meaning immortality and health. Like the bitter yellow tansy, I may be sensitive and small, but am weather-worn and stand through storms, ready for what is blown my way. Do not see only with your eyes, but listen closely too, very still, and hear as I do the small fire within. I am ready for the next season, my tansy season. I am tough but lacy, delicate but strong, growing, flowering, ready, every edge cut just so for you, old man weather. This little tansy Julie grows on, blooms on, lives on, tansy, immortal me. Now this one was requested, eagle, hawk, killdeer, chickadee. Some people say it is luck to see a bald eagle or a hawk. So you would think I'd be more fortuitous seeing hawks and eagles nearly every trip to the field. Yesterday, it was a bald eagle perched high in the tallest tree, then two hawks circling, hunting together. A set of killdeers called out from the sandy wetland, and a pair of chickadees who nest near my office greet me each morning as I walk by. Perhaps Mother Earth's way of blessing is from an alternate vantage point. My luck isn't in the number of times I've failed or the ways I prove inadequate. My favor is in the ability to withstand loss and the family who accepts my brokenness. It is in the soaring eagle I see and the fawn I come across unexpectedly. It is in each green thing I watch push through the soil each spring. It is hope and resilience and life. Now I'm going to switch from horizons to a couple new things I've been working on. This one was from an online workshop. It is simply called Pastoral Elegy. I'm talking to the willow tree in my yard in the city as it stretches over the alley toward our loud neighbors. I say I would take it to visit the flowering pear of my rural home if I could, the decade I lived in a town of only 600 people. A home I could sit on the back steps and hear only frogs and cicadas singing at night under clearly lit stars. No city lights clouding the sparkle of the sky. But the willow tree and I are rooted here in the city. There is no family of wasps to greet living in a swing set of my small children. My son and daughter are adults now. I see no pair of great-winged polyphemus moths resting under the picnic table. It sits, paint peeling, untouched, and benches bowing from disuse. No poppy mallows pop up in my flower beds along the house. Drought has dried even the grass to strands of brown scattered in the weedy lawn. I bend under the willow, picking up branches the last windstorm has released from its owner, and walk to place them in the burn pile, a sort of offering to the gods of nostalgia. Come spring, when the lacewings alight at my porch, we shall gather at the fire pit and have something to turn to ashes. I am now going to read a love poem to my daughter. This is called Dug My Way Out, Blood and Fire. Some of you will recognize the title. It's based on a song lyric by Pink. Dug my way out, blood and fire. As I turn the corner to walk towards home, a single pink baby sock rests in the grass. A beaten, trampled, lost partner, leaving 5 tiny toes bare and exposed. An infant foot open to the cold air. I remember when you were yet a baby, over 2 decades ago, before you had to fight your way out of this world's blood and fire. How does one dig out of a fire? Cinders sparking, coals lit surrounding you, the world black and orange, dark and bright all at once. You wish you could fly away. Take my hand despite ourselves. Hang on to this heart, this soil. Somehow we made it, didn't we? You are the unexpected laugh on the quiet subway. The poinsettia regrowing its leaves in April on a south-facing windowsill. The unwritten scars buried beneath skin, healed with time and grit and knitted brow. Blood and fire beat at you, but you stand, this is me, and I cry every time I hear that. Cry when I think of you digging your own way out toward the sun, past the ashes and wounds and storm. Your soul is the soil unbound, the dust swirling to reform the dunes to a mountain majestic. And I am amazed, my toes in the prairie sod, still gazing, bleeding all this love for you. I'm going to close it with a poem that was inspired by a poem and a person. You have always been here. I tried not to love you, but you've always been here in the soft place, beneath the splintered wooden lathe that run under my plastered skin. No, I shouldn't start out that way. We shouldn't start with me failing at this warmth caught in my throat, this flush in my cheeks, smiling at the whirlpool centered under tongue, rushing down to belly, settling behind skin you refuse to see. If I take your arm as we walk down the sidewalk, what do we call this? Love? If you entwine your fingers, hold my hand to switch sides with me so you are walking on the side of me closest to the street, an honorary protection you provide against the world, what do we call this love? If we hug and I place my cheek to yours, hold on a little longer just to feel someone holding me, just to be held, is this the touch of friendship? Do we call this platonic love? If we grasp hands across the table as we talk to emphasize a conversation, do we call this an aromantic love? If you rub my white, cold fingers to bring blood back into circulation after I hold an iced coffee, do we have to name this type of love? Is what is between us needing a name? If you are always here, then are not you some central part of me? Some nerve or blood or essential nutrient I absorb when you are near? I tried not to love you, but you have always been here, always slept in my cells, run electric currents, your palms, lightning, and breath. I want to be your hand, show you the rest of my world, galaxies of mist evaporating. Call it platonic, call it love, call it holding a place you have always held. Only know I have tried. I tried not to love you, but you have always been here. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Next, we'll be hearing from Kelly Weber. Kelly is the author of We Are Changed to Deer at the Broken Place by Tupelo Press and You Bury the Birds in My Pelvis, winner of the 2022 Omnidon First Second Book Prize. They have been nominated for the Pushcart Prize. Their work has appeared or is forthcoming in AGNI, Pleiades, Waxwing, Gulf Coast Online, Electric Literature's The Commuter, Southeast Review, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from Colorado State University. And now, Kelly Weber.
Thank you all so much for having both of us here today, both Julie and I. Thank you for sharing this space with us. Before we get started, I am going to read one statement that is adapted from a statement drafted by RAWI, Radius of Arab American Writers, or Radius of Arab Writers, initially for AWP, the Association of Writers and Presses conference a couple of months ago, and I and some other folks have just kind of kept it going from event to event. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathering during an active genocide taking place in Gaza and that the current violence in Palestine is the continuation of decades of colonial violence under Israeli apartheid. I stand in solidarity with victims of genocide in Sudan and Congo and with the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands this event is being held, including the Omaha, Ponca, Oda Missouri, and Iowa tribes. I stand firmly against anti-blackness and recognize that police violence and all white supremacist violence must be named and opposed. These forms of violence, along with transphobic violence being legislated in Nebraska and other states, endanger the lives of trans, queer, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people. Therefore, as we begin our event, I wish to underscore that none of us are free until all of us are free, and that all anti-racist, liberationist, and decolonial struggles are intertwined. The book I'm going to be reading from today is my second collection. It's called You Bury the Birds in My Pelvis, and in this book, I really wanted to explore, in particular, the concept of queer platonic intimacy. So I'm ace aro and trans non-binary, and there's so many wonderful books about romantic love and all sorts of attraction like that. They just don't resonate with my experience as somebody who is sapphic but doesn't really experience traditional sexual or romantic attraction. I was just interested in writing other types of love poems, and so that's a lot of what this book explores, some experiences as a queer person. I'm going to read around 5 poems today. Some of the poems are going to reference chronic illness. Just want to offer that as a content warning. Others will reference some animal death as well. So just want to offer both of those before I begin. How to draw yourself as daughter. Begin with you and your mother following the bleeding fox across the field. No, begin with your mother weeping. Birth this story with your body in the mirror, herringboned and hemorrhaging into girl. Your mother's hand cupped over yours, arcing your arm across red fur. Voice a new moon falling into black water. Study in graphite how girls dress their marrow in blood here. Fasten white buttons across red flannel and bury dawn behind the sternum. Let's say in this little frame of paper, you step toward her and anything could happen. Before sunrise, antlers in your throat. Frost and rust, revealing every father's tractor on the night highway, a mouth of needles. Grip the pencil and look into your friend's eyes as you both count down to state the animals you are. The word queer is barbed wire strung across pink sky and snow, larkspur and lupine rising from pelvis. Return here to your mother, the fox dragging itself across frozen grass, the widened eye, the small red spooling beneath your hands that don't know what to call forgiveness, what to call mercy. Beneath the fur, beneath the ice, you must know how to draw the skeleton first. I'm going to read a poem that's after my dear friend Margaret F. Brown, who writes such beautiful, sensual, erotic poems, and so this poem is written after and toward her. Ode to Asexual Libido. The cure for hysteria, finger on clit, throat opening for wandering womb, hammered into such arterial gold, afternoon sunlight, hot as names in the belly, oh gland, swelling breath, satin stroke, the labial murmuration of birds, splintering, anxious pupil into ring, indigo, rain above mountains dilating, oh hands wet circle, both disorder of desire and treatment for, not wanting anyone else in these sigh hips, arched into all that penitent sky, pelvis hinged up and down, the impossible asexual girl ache faster, pulse a honeyed lock, gasping vulva, widening carnivorous covenant, the uterus flush, and again that alleviates pain, that reminds how to howl, oh yes, oh God, killed and brought back broken to hum like a promise, severed at the daughter. O femoral, O wrist, O vein pounding with thirst. If this is first praise, then let every horizon shudder and spit. The cervix coughing lightning back to brain through the jaws and thighs sugared as dirt. O cactus flowers opening, O release the thunder into blood. A new word for tremble is burial. Queer platonic, all aspens share a heart system. But what are my lungs if not your hands buried in my chest? We sleep in the mountain's shadow, curled beneath a blanket of horsehair and stars, kissed with kerosene and dust. Wind's trembling daughter aspens. If your father knew to call this queer, would he break a wall or into a mouthful of snow? I watched dawn take the peak from our cabin window, char forged to lakes rippled ache, our blood still learning to breathe up here, pink grafting granite to black sky, stars. You rise and run in fog, a cradle of antlers. If I press your small palm against my side to feel the frantic pulse, frost will gather on your fingers like a window-shocked warm. If I erode my breath into praise, I can call this a kind of faith. It is not faith how a mountain gives up its winter, but the shock of killing warmth, fire hungering the lungs of birds. If you press a palm to tundra, each blade can take 100 years to pulse back. My immunosuppressed body catches, lets go of each bright fracture. Tell me how our blood locks across distances, hips a canyon of hard stars. Tell me how I can't even say I love you, my girl mouth a wire in the dark. I know how to starve for someone's touch. You once scooped a stunned bird, fingers so thin I saw red light through skin. You folded its trembling in your hands and snapped its neck. We used to dance in the horse barn, you gripping my wrists in the old smell of animal sweat. I've risked sharing my breath with you. I'm going to read just one or two more. On being the queer person I was always afraid I'd be. When you breathe on the bed next to me, I remember when I went searching for wild foxes, because I didn't want to keep holding your name under my tongue until it killed me. Because I tried so hard not to love you, let you love me. But like the skinned heifer that fell off the back of the truck that the flies found in the middle of the road near my house, I was zipped into such a sequin blood humming for you. You, hematite mercy in me, a lodestone I can find any time I lose my way. This poem, a home I've tried to make for you, the way I hold everything soft in my belly, every highway where barbed wire stitches the winter clouds shut, looping across my hips, knees, sacrum. If you open your eyes, if you take my wrists, pulse between your fingers, the canyon's frozen river will bloom purple lupine right out of the ice, each valve in my chest a place you can hide your unholiest prayers. You give me back to myself, make me what I am, the way breath and flesh join at the sternum. Why is it so hard just to say it, just to choir our tongues into words all the fathers in our lives never wanted us to learn? Before I met you, a woman accused me by mouth before I knew what it meant, before I knew if I wanted to be her or be close to her or that it was ace. And the rarest of times I thought I felt something for a girl, I learned to hold my breath for you. Because it would have been easier just to stop my mouth the way I stopped my hands from tightening your black pea coat around you when it snowed around us in the prairie city. We shared the list of hurt we carry, and I didn't pull you into a hug so tight it crushed your coffee cup between us. But now you say it and press your palms to my sick belly, the x-rays of my gut looping up past my heart, the needle bruises in my thighs where I have to wound myself every other week to stay alive. I couldn't find any foxes because they all died of mange. So call this what it is. How you move toward me first, how you say it when I can't. Lace your fingers with mine across my navel. Call this a cauterized moon, the place where I separated from my mother's body to find yours. Call this belief blush and maxilla, index of fevers. Call it fossil that remembers water enough to be soft. Call it vein encrypted with your voice. Rhapsody of ghost. Call it how I'll always come find you. Call it so loud we can't hear all the people grafting scripture to the air against the local pride club, hosting a drag show to beat cancer. Call it my immune system turning your hands gliding over me to cloud shadow. Call it how language lives in a warm place inside you and you invite me there. Call it because to be loved by someone's throat is to let the wind take you to your knees, to worry you're enough to depend upon. The heart, an animal, staggering away from the road to the field of snow. Call her name and see how fast this beast can run to your side. If we want to, if we let each other in, if we stay, if we say it, there's no going back. If your cheekbones are telephone wires splitting dawn into stanzas of birds. If you open, they're singing inside me. If you hold me there, one hand on my clavicle against the cold. If we can hug each other through the ribs like it's enough. And I'm going to close with just one more poem. Instead of chewing a hole in my lip and swallowing the blood, let's say rain before dawn. Say the dead fox in the meadow. Say you come to tell me of it. Say cloud and chest, hollow around heart. Say purple gay feather. Say I ask you to tell me the skull and I draw your face. Say you touch the softest part of my throat. Say you slide a knife into my belly and gut me. Gently lift out each organ and weigh it in your hands. Set each one aside until I fall to pearl and pink glisten, slicking your fingers. Say you cut my eyes and call each one beautiful. Say you cradle my lungs. Say you breathe for both of us. My skeleton waking up hitched to your morning field. Grass beneath the thunder. Say you call me your little moon, your little lupine root, your animal gentled to your voice with a hand on my neck. Say your words give me back to myself. Say our mother's call, asking if we're okay. Say needles line the fridge like latches to my blood. Say a little red pools inside a mouth. Say today I am still alive. Say today I do not chew my way through the tender traps of palm and mercy. Say the sky full of tongue after tongue, still singing every way there is to hold a pulse. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And I just want to say there is something very special about hearing poetry from the mouths of the people who created it. And that's what makes things like the Ames reading so very special, is because poetry comes alive when its creators say it out loud. If anybody has any questions, you are absolutely welcome to ask. As both Kelly and Julie also have copies of their books here. So I'm going to open the floor to any questions and any mingling you'd like to do. No one has a question. I will ask one. Where did you get the titles for your books?
I've actually had the title for my book since I was a freshman in college, which I'm not young, so that has been a while. I took my first soil science class, Soil 153, and the first time I learned that soil layers were called horizons, I said, that's the name of a poetry book. And I held on to that for 25 years, and that's how I got the title of my book.
Finding a title, I realized, is, if any of you have ever thrown clay, it's a lot like learning to center a piece of clay when you're throwing a pot, which is a skill that I have still not mastered, and just really could not get the feel for in my body, and ended up not practicing it further. I would say it took me like a good 10 years of continuous practice to arrive at a point where I could start to develop titles that did work for the poem, that were interesting, that were not completely opaque. And that definitely includes book titles, which is something I struggled with for a really long time. And then kind of like learning to throw clay and get it centered. At a certain point, just after enough practice and practice and practice, I finally got the feel of how to center a title, kind of like a piece of clay. And so now when I work on a book, I just know I have a better feeling for that process and for a title that needs to be there. I think for this title, I had the book in progress, and it had gone through a few different iterations of what it could be, what it wanted to be about, what it ultimately ended up being about, which it kind of cohered into something very different from when it started. And at some point in that process, I just kept giving myself free writing periods of like, what images are coming up, what are we thinking about? And through just kind of that sort of play, at some point, the title just kind of popped out. And that's sort of how the title of my first book was too. Just through a lot of allowing myself space to play and just running a lot of different phrases. And then in a lot of ways, it's usually when I walk away from a book and I'm doing something else during my day that the right phrase will pop in there. And it's like, that is the title. And I can feel that centered in the book. And it's kind of a weird sort of long, messy process at arriving there. But then it's really satisfying. I can feel kind of the moment in my body when it just sort of clicks, it centers. I'm like, that's the title. And that's sort of how this title came to be.
Would you like to talk about like your process? I'm always interested, like, do you like to write on paper? Do you handwrite? Do you like to write in the middle of the night? Like, what's something that's like kind of about your process that's special?
I have a number of these. I always write on paper first with a pencil. I don't know why it has to be a pencil, but it does. My sister likes finding them for me. She finds the perfect size and the perfect thickness. I don't know where she finds them, but I write in them all the time. And I have to handwrite them first, and then I type them onto a computer and reshape them, edit them, and that's when I need silence. Like no music, nothing. I need to hear them as well. After I write them, they need to sound correctly. And so first it's writing by hand, and I don't know if that's a Bill Clefcorn thing. He was my mentor for a while, and he hand wrote it first, and then he would edit and edit and edit, and I think I learned that from him. And I started out with these yellow legal pads that I had to write on, but they're not very portable. This I can slip into a bag and I take it wherever I go, and that's when I switched over to these. So
I draft on the computer, which I understand is something a bit of blasphemy for the writing community. Like I've seen, I feel like I've heard so many talks that are like it's composed by hand only, and I think that's great. My handwriting is close to illegible, including for me, especially for me. And I think I do so much of my work on the computer that I know my handwriting is slowing down as to when I did it all the time in school, so it's just faster to type it. So I tend to write in just these big long blocks in a Word document. I have a free writing Word document that I let get like 800, 900, 1,000 pages long, and at a certain point just cut it off and start a new one. Just to kind of let it be this amorphous blob space where it's like it's in what I consider a very unattractive font, and I can just kind of like draft freely in there, and it's a huge mess. But then when I want to actually start like curating things into poems, I can also run a search feature, and that makes it a lot more efficient for me because it's like generates so much free writing material. To just do like Control F, like, oh, I know I was thinking about this image like 6 months ago. Where is it in here? And do Control F, and then from there I can like, oh look, here's like part of a poem. This is like not a full poem, but it's part of a poem. It's a tale of a poem. I find poem tales all the time. Like, where's the head? It's somewhere in here. It's like an eel I'm trying to pull out. So I finally like extract the poem and kind of shape it from there. But yeah, I think leaving space for it to be really messy and a lot of drafts. And I feel like in many ways writing in a big Word document feels a little bit like an electronic version of a legal pad in some ways, just in terms of the size. And I know it's interesting, I've heard some poets talk about, I was reading a prose poem a couple of years ago, I taught a prose poem, and it's got these really rigid lines and a really distinctive shape. And I was asking questions for the group about like, why did the poet choose that shape? And one of the participants that I didn't realize knew the poet was like, oh, he wrote it that way because those were the margins of his notebook. And I was like, oh, I never thought about that. But I think that that's actually a really useful thing. Like, it's just, I think sometimes notebooks and things can form natural line breaks and shapes and can sometimes become a space into which it's like a form that we work in, even if we reshape it later. And I find sometimes that like setting a free writing kind of like blank Word document does that for me in some strange way. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I have an impossible question, so I'm going to ask it. Because you both, I know, have taken things from your lives and used them as many poets do, many writers do. Where do you see yourself writing, or what kinds of things do you think you might be writing 3 to 5 years from now? Is there something that you want to explore, that you just haven't had the experience, or you haven't been pushed to do, or anything like that?
It was an impossible question.
I know, but it's something to think about. There might be some things that have been kind of running around in your mind that you think, well, I might
Well, I'm
pursue that.
above my 1,000 poem. I've written more than 1,000 poems, so I will be further along on that, I know. And I will probably still be writing from Robert Brewer's Writer's Digest prompts every April and November. I will still be doing that. I will probably be playing around with more manuscript ideas. I just have started one, okay, I will say it then, exit strategy. And it's different ways of saying goodbye are the different categories. So see you later, alligator is a section. So there are different ways of saying goodbye, and they're playing with different ideas on that. So maybe I'll be developing that a little further.
You know, it's tough to know how my obsessions will evolve. I know what my obsessions are and have been, which is like the body, foxes, queerness, and it's like all sorts of things that are in there that I think just continue to show up. But I hope my poems just get weirder, because I think there's this tendency, especially early on, where it's like you write, and then sometimes you're like, okay, this is what a poem in a journal looks like. I should write for that. And then I feel like in some ways then the natural evolution as an artist, at least for me, is like stripping away some of that. Like, oh, it needs to look like this. Which is not to say that I don't want to be influenced by artists, because I am, and I do, and I read a lot, and I love so many poems. And I think a lot of what I try to do as an artist is, in some ways, tune that out enough to just listen to what the poem actually wants to be, which may not always look like a thing that could go in a journal. Sometimes it's a thing where you're like, I don't know what this is, it's weird. And I think allowing poems to be deep-sea anglerfish that are a little bit spooky upon first appearance is a useful artistic strategy, at least for me. You mentioned earlier, like, get uncomfortable, and I think that that's what I'm always trying to do in a book. And so I don't know exactly what that'll look like over the next 3 to 5 years, but I hope it will just continue to look like that more and more, and that the poems are allowed to become their own increasingly strange selves that are removed from the limits of my own ambition on them.
Yes, I hope to keep being uncomfortable.
Yes, that's a great,
Yes.
yeah, keep being uncomfortable.
Because I learn new things. I will
Yeah,
keep pulling from people that challenge me.
yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, if that's all the questions, then we'll like call that the formal end of the program. Of course, you're all welcome to mingle, look around the Heritage Room, speak to our poets, and most importantly, thank them for a wonderful reading.